We Protestants have taken Mary and Joseph, and we have made them into cardboard characters or little figurines in a nativity scene, but they were parents. And like all of us who have been parents, they had to make decisions. They had to make choices about how they were going to raise the Son of God. And there isn't very much information in the scriptures about how they raised him. I mean, I really wish they would have told us what Mary did the first time he didn't put a dish away after he'd eaten. I really wish that they'd tell us what Joseph did when his tone wasn't so great with his younger siblings. And I really wish, like all parents who've had adolescent males, that they would have told us what they did when he didn't want to take a shower. But we don't get that information. We do, however, get told about several of the values that Mary and Joseph had that are clearly in the scriptures. And you've just heard those in this little skit. The first of those was protection. When Mary and Joseph heard from their father, when they heard from the Lord about Herod's plan to kill all infants, all children under the age of 2, they obeyed and they took that child to Egypt. Even though it cost them tremendously, they left their family, they left their work, they left their home, and they went to a non-Hebrew country. But they were committed to protecting their son. They were committed to obeying what the Father told them to do to protect their son. Secondly, their second value was to nurture him, to raise him up to be a man of God, even though he was God. 3 times in the beginning of Luke 2, we hear about how Mary and Joseph followed the law of Moses. And then later in Luke, we hear about how every Passover, they took their family and went to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. The author of Luke really wants us to know that there's a connection between following God's law, being raised up in the faith, and becoming the man who would be, the God-man who would be our Savior. Luke wants us to know, as instructed by God, that raising Jesus, to take him to worship, to be in a community that celebrated religious observance, to follow the law every day, to build him in character, was an important part of becoming our Savior. And we owe them a debt of gratitude that Mary and Joseph did all those things so that Jesus was who he was. And finally, we learn right away in Luke 1 that Mary was devoted to God. And even in her prayer while she was pregnant, she spoke about the privilege of bearing the Son of God, the privilege and the honor. There are many times in Luke where we hear about how Mary and sometimes Joseph were amazed, or they marveled, where they treasured the things that God was revealing to them about their son. Mary took time with her heart and with her mind to contemplate and think about what God was teaching her about Jesus and about what those things meant for his life and for her life, for our life. Mary treasured Jesus. She was responsible for him, but we all know that you can be responsible for things and not love them. Mary and Joseph loved Jesus and honored him and reverenced his Father in the ways that they deserved. We are not called to bear Jesus literally like Mary did, but we are no doubt called to bear witness to him in the world. So when I read this passage, these passages that we've just spoken about, I felt really convicted. And I want to share with you that when I was a brand new Christian in my 20s, I knew that I was fragile, I knew that I was weak, and I knew that I needed to protect my young faith. I knew that what I had been before Jesus was living in death, and I never wanted to be there again. And so in those early years, I put up strong protections. Though I am not opposed to moderate alcohol use, in those early years I didn't drink because I knew that I would be tempted to make mistakes. And I asked my friends who were Christians to support me and hold me accountable to walk with me so that I would make good decisions. In those first few years when I read the scriptures and when I studied it, it was all new to me and it was like dessert. I consumed it as though everything I was reading was critical to my daily life. I had great Bible teachers who were leading me and teaching me about the faith. And even though I didn't know very much about Jesus, I knew that he was God and I was a sinner and that he had saved my life. And so I loved him in all the ways I knew how to at that time. Now, I've been a Christian many years. And I don't know about you, but because I spend time around people in the church all the time, it's very tempting for me to think that I'm safe in my faith. And friends, that's just not true. Our friends are a part of helping us protect our faith, but it's not enough. I have just as many temptations as I had when I was in my 20s. They're just different temptations. Temptations to pride, temptations to laziness, temptations to complacency and distraction and gluttony because you all keep bringing me food. We have to protect our faith by doing things to make it less likely that we're going to be falling into those sins that plague us. And secondly, though I read the scriptures every day, if you're like me, many of us, I start reading that story and I think, I know that one. I know that one. I'm familiar with it. And so I don't come into it with that kind of expectation that God has something for me today that I've never seen before. I've stopped thinking of it as dessert and started thinking of it more as something I have to do, or at least it's easy to do that. And finally, though I love him, I do love Jesus. Just like those of you who've been married for many years, I have to be very intentional not to take my husband Jonathan for granted. And I have to be very intentional not to take the relationship I have with Jesus, treasuring him, for granted. Now, some of you out there may not struggle with these things at all. I hope there are people who have just been blooming in the Lord this year and you feel like I'm doing all the things I need to be doing. But if you're like me and you feel like I want to do this better in 2012, then let's join together and think through how can we better protect our faith, how can we better nourish our faith, and how can we better treasure Jesus, loving him and his children this year. I would invite you, as I have just done actually this morning, to take about 20 minutes and think through for yourself an action plan. What's at least one thing I can do to love him better, protect my faith better, or treasure and love Jesus and his children this year? Share it with a friend. Send it to me in an email so that you hold yourself accountable. Ask for help. And then we will do this thing together, one baby step at a time, one goal at a time in 2012, because he is worthy. Go ahead.
Give me Jesus, give me Jesus. You can have all this world, but give me Jesus.